All right, today we are diving deep into a really dense and fascinating theological analysis of the Quran's 27th chapter, Surah An-Naml. And this isn't light reading. This exegesis takes on some of the biggest questions at the very heart of faith and reason. Questions like, what exactly is knowledge? How are we supposed to understand miracles in a world that seems to run on physical laws? And maybe the biggest paradox of all, how can we have genuine free will if God's knowledge is absolute, perfect, and eternal? This is a serious deep dive, so let's get right into it.
So here's our roadmap for navigating this argument. First, we're going to look at the Quranic verses that really set the stage for the whole problem. Then we'll explore a really key distinction the author makes between two fundamentally different types of knowledge. You'll see how that distinction becomes the key to unlocking the logic of miracles. After that, we'll get into what it truly means for God to be Al-Alim, the all-knowing. And finally, we'll see how this whole structure attempts to resolve that timeless tension between God's will and our human choices.
Okay, first things first, the foundation. Any solid argument has to start with its source text, right? And this analysis is deeply rooted in a specific passage from the Quran. And this passage, it doesn't just introduce a topic, it actually sets up a major philosophical problem about what revelation is even for. The entire argument that's presented here is meticulously built on Scripture. This isn't just some abstract philosophical exercise. The whole theological framework is grounded in a really close reading of specific verses from that 27th chapter of the Quran. That chapter, An-Naml, actually translates to the ant. And believe me, that name is going to become very significant when we start talking about miracles a little later on.
Now this is crucial. Look at how the Quran is framed right from the start. It's presented as a decisive text, a kind of ultimate judge or criterion meant to step in and resolve these long-standing theological debates that previous communities, in this case the children of Israel, were having. So it's being positioned as more than just a book of stories or laws, it's a source of definitive, clarifying truth. And that, right there, sets an incredibly high bar for the kind of knowledge we're about to explore.
And that framing leads us directly to the central question of the whole analysis. If a text is making a claim to this kind of ultimate clarity, what does that imply about the nature of knowledge itself? I mean, how do we possibly reconcile what we can see and touch and measure in our everyday lives with a type of knowledge that claims to be absolute, transcendent, and totally complete? And that is the core dilemma this text sets out to resolve. To even begin to answer that question, the argument introduces this really powerful idea. It suggests that to truly understand reality, we have to recognize that there aren't just one, but two fundamentally different realms of knowledge. And each one operates with its own rules, its own scope, and its own source.
So here on the screen, the analysis lays out these two opposing but still connected categories. On one side, you have what's called ilm tajribi, or empirical knowledge. This is the world of science, of physical evidence, of everything we learn through our senses and through experiments. But on the other side, you have ilm ilahi, or divine knowledge. And the argument here is that these two aren't just different in scale, like a puddle versus an ocean. No, they're different in their very essence. Let's take a closer look.
So first up, empirical knowledge. This is the knowledge that built our entire modern world. It's acquired step by step, piece by piece, through that slow, careful process of hypothesis, experiment, verification. It's cumulative, right? Newton builds on Galileo, Einstein builds on Newton. But according to this exegesis, its greatest strength is also its biggest limitation. It is completely bound to the physical, material world. It simply has no tools to see or measure or even comment on any reality that might exist beyond its own physical and time-bound constraints.
And then, in stark contrast, you have divine knowledge. This is not something that is learned or acquired. The analysis is really clear on this. It simply is. It's an essential attribute of God's very being. That Arabic term, kul, is so important here. It signifies a totality, an all-encompassing nature that is absolute. This knowledge isn't pieced together over time. It is instantaneous, it is complete, and it is free from any possibility of error. It understands both the seen, the entire physical universe, and the unseen, or al-ghaib. And in this framework, it's the ultimate source from which all reality, even the laws that make empirical knowledge possible, comes from.
Okay, so this distinction immediately creates a huge intellectual challenge. If our entire system for figuring out what's true, science, observation, repeatable experiments, is based on empirical evidence, then what do we do with events that seem to break the very laws of that system? How can a mind that's trained to think empirically possibly get a handle on something that, by its very definition, defies all known experience? And this, of course, brings us to the topic of miracles.
And this is exactly where the text brings in the whole concept of miracles.
but not as some kind of random, chaotic violation of the cosmic order. Instead, it presents them as logical, purposeful demonstrations of that higher, divine reality intervening in our limited, empirical world for a very specific reason.
This definition is so important to grasp. A miracle, ijaz in Arabic, literally means something that makes others incapable of copying it. The text is very clear that a miracle is not causeless. That's a misunderstanding. Instead, its cause lies outside the closed system of cause and effect that science is able to measure. It's an event that intentionally disrupts the normal patterns of nature to point towards the existence of the lawmaker, basically demonstrating that the reality we can observe is not the only reality there is.
The analysis then turns to examples from Surah An-Nam itself, which is just perfect. In the story, a hoopoe bird, who was part of King Solomon's army, goes missing. When it comes back, it explains that it's just come from the land of Sheba, and it gives this detailed report. It identifies the female ruler, describes her throne, and notes that her people worship the sun instead of God. I mean, this isn't just a bird squawking, it's a detailed intelligence briefing. And then, a little later, an ant is described as seeing Solomon's army approaching and warning its whole colony to get back into their homes, showing this complex awareness and communication.
So, from a purely empirical point of view, this is impossible. The brain of a hoopoe or an ant just doesn't support abstract geopolitical analysis or complex linguistic commands. But the Quran states these events as facts, and the argument being made is that this isn't just an allegory. It's a demonstration of knowledge and communication happening on a totally different plane, one that was made accessible to these specific creatures by divine will. It forces you, the reader, to ask whether your own empirical framework is really the only way to measure what's real.
Another classic example that's cited is the miracle of Moses' staff. Empirically, we can analyze the cellular structure, the chemical composition of a piece of wood, all the way down to the atomic level, and at no point in that analysis will we find some hidden potential for it to spontaneously reorganize itself into the complex biological systems of a living snake. This event doesn't just bend the rules of physics and biology, it completely shatters them. It's a demonstration of a power that can literally reconstitute matter at a fundamental level just by a command.
So, if these aren't just random displays of power, what are they for? What's the function? Why would the very author of nature's laws decide to just suspend them? Well, the analysis gives a very specific theological answer.
Their whole purpose is to serve as a burhan, which means a powerful, compelling proof or demonstration. And this word implies more than just evidence. It's an argument that's meant to be intellectually and spiritually decisive. Miracles, in this view, are designed to directly challenge a worldview that is purely materialistic. They're like these huge signposts, pointing beyond the limits of our senses and suggesting that the empirical framework, while it's incredibly powerful and useful, is ultimately incomplete if you want to explain the whole of reality.
And all of this leads us right to the nature of divine knowledge itself. So now that a reality beyond the purely empirical has been established, the analysis starts to explore how this divine knowledge isn't just a characteristic of God, but is actually part of his very essence and is manifested through his names.
This verse is presented as absolutely foundational. The very first act of divine teaching for humanity, according to the Quran, wasn't teaching a set of rules, but teaching the names, el-asma, of everything. Now, in this theological context, a name isn't just a label. It's the key to the essence and the reality of a thing. So to be taught the names means to be given insight into the very nature of creation itself, linking divine knowledge directly to our human ability to understand.
Here, the exegesis makes a really critical philosophical point. We, as human beings, have knowledge. It's something we go out and acquire. But for God, knowledge, or ilm, is what he is. It's not an added quality. It's inseparable from his being. This concept is then expressed through his names. God doesn't just happen to know a lot of things. He is El-Alim, the all-knowing. That name reflects an eternal, active, and essential reality.
And the implications of this idea are just staggering. I mean, if knowledge is part of God's essence, it has to be absolute, and it can't be tied to the limitations we have as created beings. This means it's not bound by the linear flow of time. For an eternal being, past, present, and future are all simultaneously present in a single unified awareness. This knowledge is also absolute in its scope. It covers everything from clusters of galaxies down to the most fleeting secret thought in a human heart. It is the ultimate reality from which all other realities flow.
The analysis then puts this verse on the table, and it's basically a powerful, logical argument framed as a rhetorical question. It's asking, how could the one who created something not have perfect, intimate knowledge of that creation? The argument is that the very act of creation necessitates complete knowledge. The designer of the most complex machine knows that machine inside and out.
The verse is essentially saying that creation itself is the ultimate proof of omniscience.
And all of this, these two realms of knowledge, the logic behind miracles, the nature of absolute omniscience, it all brings us to the final and most challenging part of the analysis. We're now face to face with the great theological paradox. How do you reconcile a God who knows everything with a human being who is genuinely free to make choices?
This is the question that has echoed through centuries of philosophy and theology. If God's knowledge is absolute and exists outside of time, that means he knows with perfect certainty every single choice I will ever make. He knows the words I'm about to say right now. So, if the outcome is already known, is my act of choosing a genuine freedom, or am I just an actor playing out a script that was written in eternity? This is the problem of ikhtiar, or meaningful free choice, and this text tackles it head-on.
So the resolution that's offered is the sophisticated four-part argument. First, and this is the most critical part, is the distinction between knowledge and cause. The idea is that God's knowledge is a knowledge of observation, not of compulsion. Think of it this way. If you watch a recording of a basketball game you already saw, your foreknowledge of the final score doesn't cause the players to make the shots. The argument is that God's knowledge is on an infinitely higher plane, knowing what we will freely choose to do. Second, the text points out that the Quran is filled with verses that demand human accountability. The whole idea of reward and punishment would be completely unjust if our choices weren't real. Third, our free will is presented as a genuine cause within the universe God created. Our choices are real causes that produce real effects. And finally, the analysis distinguishes God's knowledge from his will, or irada. It is God's divine will for us to have free will. So his knowledge doesn't cancel out our choice. It perfectly encompasses it.
And to put the final nail in this argument, the exegesis brings in this verse, which establishes a fundamental difference in the order of being. God, as the uncaused creator, is the one who sets the parameters of reality. Humans, as created beings who act within that reality, are therefore accountable for their actions. This very concept of being questioned is presented as the ultimate textual proof that human choice is real, it's meaningful, and it's deeply consequential.
And this brings us to the author's final conclusion. The dilemma is resolved not by watering down God's knowledge or by diminishing human freedom, but by reframing the entire relationship. In this view, divine omniscience and human free will aren't a contradiction that needs to be solved. Instead, it's God's absolute knowledge and power that actually create the very space, the very framework for a meaningful human choice to exist in the first place. It is a truly profound thought on the nature of what it means to know, to act, and to be.